Thank you, my friend Puya and Frank and George and all the other friends who are here. And I thank you very much for the bracha to the Rav, which I value very much. I feel a special tie to this community, to the Iranian community. Last Sunday morning, I was in Great Neck to speak to the Mashadi community there, and have for the last 10 years, I guess, devoted a good part of my time to the issues related to Iran, and have the privilege of working with the community here, my very good friends and relationships that we have developed over the years in our common effort to assure the security of the Jews of Iran, and also to address the challenges that Iran poses to us. I want to try and address, if I addressed all the issues that Frank mentioned, that you and I would be here until Mincha and maybe until Ma'ariv, so I will try to quickly address some of these topics and put them in the context also of the issue that Iran poses for us. You know, many people ask me, when I literally devoted the years of my life to the Iran 13 case and to the plight of Iranian Jews, you know, I'm a Jew of German Jewish heritage. They said, what are you, a good yeket, doing involved in all of these things? And the same question was asked of me a number of years ago when I headed the Soviet Jewry movement and led all the big protests and organized the efforts. And the answer really lies in the core of Jewish history. And that is that the one precondition for success for the Jewish people throughout our history, from Har Sinai, where we stood ki ish echad b'leiv echad, that we stood as one person with one heart, that was the one precondition that HaKadosh Baruch Hu set for giving us the Torah, was that we had to have achdut, we had to have unity within the Jewish people. And this has been true throughout our history. Why did Haman think he could address and deal with the Jewish community in Persia when he saw what happened to his grandfather Amalek? He saw what price he paid. Because as he says in the Haggadah, he saw the Jews as Am Mufuzar Umufurad, that they were a divided people, spread out, not unified. And because of that, he saw their vulnerability. And Esther Amalka saw the answer, the antidote to it, when she said, Lech kenos es kol ha-Yehudim, go and gather all of the Jews. That if in fact we're to deal with this challenge to the Jewish future and Jewish survival, it only rests in bringing all of the Jews together in an expression of unity. The Chazal tell us that there are various forms that Achdut can take. We saw it in Bavel, when they built the Tower of Babel. All the people spoke one language. All the people unified to do evil, to try and challenge God, and God then spread amongst them 70 languages. So people can be unified because they have one language, one thought, one idea. Or people can be unified because they have a common purpose. It doesn't matter what language they speak, where they come from, or many of the things they may believe in. If we have one common purpose, if we understand what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from us, if we understand the destiny of the Jewish people rests with all of us, that we have one faith and one fate, and that what happens to one part of the Jewish people happens to all of the Jews. The fate of the Iranian 13 was our fate. It was the fate of American Jews, of Israeli Jews, of Jews all over the world. Just as protecting the Jews of Iran is a challenge for all Jews, regardless of where they live, as was the fate of the Jews of Ethiopia, or the Jews of Iraq, or the Jews of Iran, or the Jews of Yemen, or the Jews of Syria, or the Jews of Russia. We are Am Echad. We are one nation. And when we stood there, Vayichan Sham Neged Ahar, we had one common purpose in order to receive the Torah. This elevates the lowest of us to the level of the highest. That is the true unity. And it's when we all aspire to the highest possible goal, recognizing that we have unique qualities. When Yaakov blessed his sons, he said they were a Gai Ukahal Gayim. They were a nation and community of nations. How can you be both? You can't be France and the United Nations. The answer is that to the outside world we have to be a guy, one united nation, just as we understand that within ourselves we are kahal goyim, we are a community of nations, with different minhagim, with different customs, with different ideas. But to the outside world, the key to success is that we have one common front, and every chink in the armor of Jewish unity threatens us and future generations. And this achdut was never more important than it is today, because of the challenges to the Jewish future are today the most severe, I believe, certainly since the Shoah. I believe that this is the most critical watershed period. I've been doing this for more than 30 years, and I do not remember any time where the challenges and the decisions that confront us were more serious than the ones we face now. And the decisions that will be made will not just affect us and our children, but our grandchildren and their grandchildren. To me, this is what Jews are challenged. When Avraham Avinu was told to choose life, it wasn't for him alone. It was lamantichya ata v'zarecha, that you and your children and your children's children will live. How many of us realize and think about the choices of life we make every day? Every day we make choices of life. People think that somebody contemplating suicide has a choice whether to pull the trigger or not. That's not the choice of v'charta b'chaim. It is celebrating what one accomplishes in life. Our enemies extol what people wrought in their deaths. We extol what people accomplish in their lives. When Avraham Avinu was told of v'charta b'chaim, the other peoples of the world worship death. The Egyptians built pyramids to death. The Chaldeans, the Phoenicians, they worship death. The Jews were told to choose life. And sometimes choosing life is not an easy decision. For those who survived the Shoah, rebuilding Jewish life was not a rational decision. And through the ages, we've been told and reminded of this message of v'charta b'chaim, to choose life. And every time we save a Jew, every time we help a Jewish community, that is a v'charta b'chaim. And each day, each of us makes decisions about the future of our children and of our grandchildren, of our communities, and the lives they will lead, the security they will enjoy. The problem is that we're not cognizant of it. We don't think about it. We don't recognize that those are all choices. And we face enemies that don't operate by rational decisions. In Haggadah we read about Haman. Here he was the second most powerful man in this huge empire. And what does he say? With all of the wealth and all of the power he had, Kol zeh eino shava li. All of this is worth nothing to me as long as that one Jew remains standing. He was willing to sacrifice everything he had, all of his power, all of his wealth, all of his influence, because of that one Jew that wouldn't bow down to him. And throughout our history, he faced enemies that were irrational. The head of state of a major country recently asked me in a discussion, and when I visited there, why did Hitler hate the Jews so much? And I said, if you look for rational explanations for hatred, you'll never understand it. Hatred is irrational by its nature. There are rationalizations that they gave, that Hitler gave. He used the excuses of the problems that grew out of World War I, the Versailles Treaty, all of the rest, and blamed the Jews for social problems, economic problems, all of the ills in order to detract attention and to make them the scapegoats. But he was willing to sacrifice his own national goals to divert essential war material, to kill the Jews, even though it meant sacrificing his military campaign and his national aspirations. And when one understands the nature of the enemies that we face, you understand the importance that Judaism places on history. Do you know there's no word in Hebrew for history? The word we use is zechira, remembrance. And next week we read is Parshat Zachor. And all of us have to think about, why is it that history plays such an important role? Why, before we could talk about the contemporary events, we have to look back? Because for us, history is about the future. We look back in order to look forward. We remember the future. This is unique to Judaism.
That remembrance is about the future. Rav Soloveitchik once said that it's like looking at the back of a tapestry where you see the outlines but you can't connect all the dots. That it's our job to try and fill in the picture. That's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when Moshe came and confronted him, he saw the back. Because he said, first you have to look back before you look forward. That only those who understand the lessons of history, who learn those lessons, are prepared to meet the challenges of today and the opportunities of tomorrow. Who learn the responsibilities and understand our obligation to our grandparents and to our grandchildren. Hirsch said that no generation is judged in its time. We're not even judged by our children, we're judged by our grandchildren. That's when you see come to fruition the decisions you make and the actions you take. And just as we judge a generation of 70 years ago and ask what did they do during the Shoah, our grandchildren are going to ask us what did we do. We face now World War IV, a war no less dangerous than World War II for Jews, just less obvious. Have we learned the lessons of history? Winston Churchill once said, the further back you look, the further ahead you will see. Our sages, our Chazal, said it 1,000 years earlier. They understood that history was a guide to the future. We don't enjoy dwelling on the tsaras of the past. But to understand that history repeats itself, it's the enemies that arise in every generation. Which is why when we sit at the Seder in a few weeks, we say, B'chol dar v'dar omdim oleinu l'chalotenu. In every generation, enemies arise that seek to destroy us. It doesn't use the past tense. It doesn't say that sought to destroy us. It said that seeks. It's the present tense to remind us that the enemies arise in every generation. And only those who learned the lessons of the past are prepared to meet the challenges of today. How especially that is true today. When we see again challenges arising that we thought died in the 20th and even the 19th century. That the promise of a 21st century with a new world order has not materialized, and in fact we see an old world disorder. We see how little the Europeans have learned from the past. That they continue to follow the policies of appeasement and accommodation. Look how they were humiliated in the negotiations with Iran over the nuclear program. And the response each time to every slap, to every lie, to every distortion, to every misrepresentation was further concessions by the Europeans. When Chamberlain came back from Munich in 1939, Winston Churchill said to him, you had a choice between war and disgrace. You chose disgrace, now you'll have war. In their dealings with Iran, in their dealings with the other challenges internally and externally, the Europeans again chose disgrace, and now they face war. They face war within their borders. 40% of the births in Europe in this generation will be Muslim children. We see a radicalization of the youth. More than 70% of Muslims in Europe are under 25 years of age. One need not look at the demographic projections to understand that Europe is becoming a Muslim continent. In France, there were 50,000 acts of urban violence by Muslims last year. 1,000 cars a week are destroyed or torched. 50 policemen a week are beaten up in Paris. There are 1,200 ghettos where Jews and Christians can't live and where the police don't go. These are government statistics, not mine. Jews can't live in a lawless society. Jews can't exist where law and order doesn't rule. And we've seen what has happened in England, just the reports of the last week or two, of the stark rise in anti-Semitism, and a government interparliamentary committee that showed that with the hundreds and hundreds of anti-Semitic attacks, the numbers of arrests or prosecutions is almost nil, almost zero. Today, Britain is on the highest alert that it has been since 9/11. There are more than 30 plots now being investigated involving more than 200 armed units of extremists that the British Secret Services and police are trying to track down. There are 60 trials in England today against Islamists and 70 that are pending. They are following more than 3,000 terrorists, most of them homegrown. And they look back and they say, how did this happen? And most of all, we've seen in England the poisoning of the elites against Israel and Jews. That you cannot go onto a campus in Great Britain. as an Israeli or as a Jew who advocates for Israel, that you've seen how the elites in the society are today saying things that were even marginally acceptable on the fringes are today being uttered in the mainstream. And pay particular attention to this British example. The chief rabbi called it a tsunami of anti-Semitism. Governmental commissions talk about their great concern. We've seen a population intimidated, meaning many of the Jews. We have to learn the lessons of Europe of the 30s and Europe of the 90s. There are people who debate and say this is 1938, it's 1934, it's 1932. You know what? That is not the relevant question. The relevant question is, have we learned the lessons from those years? Are we going to spare future generations the trials and tribulations? And this is something that will affect each of us, all of us, no matter where we come from, no matter the synagogue of our affiliation, no matter how involved we are. Just as it was true 70 years ago, because our enemy sees us as one. But we cannot allow our enemies to dictate our fate. They cannot dictate what we do. We have to make that decision. That is the true form of achdus, when we strive for a common and higher principle and understand that what unites us far outweighs what divides us. We need all the resources of the community today, because what happened in Great Britain is happening in America. It is not the model of France, it's the model of Britain. And I call this the poisoning of America, because we are seeing the same things that happened in Great Britain happening in the United States today. 70 years ago, the world said the Jews to Palestine. Now they say the Jews out of Palestine. 70 years ago, they said they wanted the world Hoenlein, free of Jews. Now they say they wanted free of the Jewish state. Because Israel today is the collective representation of the Jewish people. It is the acceptable form of anti-Semitism that you can't, 70 years after the Shoah, say you hate Jews, but you can say you hate the Jewish state. That the thin veil of being anti-Zionist quickly disappears, and we know exactly what they mean. Today we see the combination of Muslim hatred and incitement with traditional anti-Semitism, with anti-Americanism and anti-Zionism coming together into a global force. You see it in the expressions in France, and I spoke 2 Fridays ago at the funeral of Ilan Khalimi of France, who was murdered a year ago, if you remember, brutally murdered, 21-year-old young man who was brought for burial, reburial on his yahrzeit to Yerushalayim. And the family asked me to speak at the funeral. And believe me, it was not an easy thing to do. But I reminded him that it took 3 weeks before the government of France would acknowledge that this was an anti-Semitic attack. When they firebombed the shul during the riots, the police commissioner was asked why they didn't show up there, and he said, why would I? It happens every day. Statistics are only part of the story. The dangerous trend that we see in Great Britain with the intellectuals, the cultural elite, starts with them, but then it trickles down to the population. Today in every poll, the pro-Israel numbers hover between 15 and 19% amongst the British people. When they were asked to describe the most disgusting country they could think of, the #1 country was Israel. I could tell you all of the examples and all of the things, but time doesn't permit it. The reason I tell you about the example of Britain is because of my concern that it is happening here. What we are seeing is the fulfillment of the process that began in Durban in 1999, when the United Nations convened the countries of the world to deal with racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, bigotry, and it turned into an orgy of hatred against Jews in Israel. The UN last week discussed reconvening the Durban conference in 2009 to assess how much progress they have made. Unfortunately, they have made a lot of progress. Because the blueprint that was laid down there that said we got rid of the apartheid South African state in the 20th century and we get rid of the Zionist apartheid state in the 21st century. Look at the progress that they have made, that a former president of the United States can put the word apartheid in the title of his book in a description about Israel. That he could sell 700,000 books and more. That a film is being made about his tour on campuses, and he said, I only put the word in to stimulate debate, yet he will never debate anybody. When they tried to bring Dennis Ross to Emory, his home university, he refused to come. When they wanted Alan Dershowitz to debate him at Brandeis, he refused. And they had to put him on after Carter left. Because his book is full of fallacious statements, historical inaccuracies. But think, would this have been possible 5 years ago? Two American professors, Walt and Mearsheimer, from Harvard and University of Chicago, published a paper this year, 82 pages, 41 of those footnotes. Not one was an original source, and every quote from an Israeli leader came from a hate website. Yet they operated with the imprimatur of Harvard University and University of Chicago until they removed their logos, but the damage was done. And what is their thesis? Only that all of the problems in the Middle East and only reason that America stands with Israel is because of the manipulations of the Jewish lobby. But you know what? They couldn't find anybody to publish their paper in America because everybody saw that it was full of distortions, historical inaccuracies, and lies. So they finally got it published in the London Review of Books, because in London, all of these taboos have been broken. It wasn't because Jews squelched it, as they said. It's because it was just not a fair and not an accurate paper. Today, 1 year later, Farrar Straus, one of the major publishers in America, is going to produce a book, and they expect to sell 1 million copies by Walt and Mearsheimer. Scott Ritter, the former inspector for the IEA, is going to publish a book this year in which he accuses Tel Aviv and Jews of being responsible for the war in Iran. That hasn't even taken place yet. In the same way they try to concoct this myth about Jews being responsible for the war in Iraq, though as far as I know, not George Bush, not Cheney, not Powell, not Rumsfeld, none of them are Jewish. And they took this term neocon as a code word for Jews. Now we see the same thing in regard to Iran. It's an effort to intimidate us, to silence us. It's not because we have failed, it's because we succeed. Because Americans stand with Israel. 70% of the American people stand with Israel today. This is an all-time record. More than 2/3 say they see Israel, along with Canada and England, as America's closest allies. We never had such numbers. But as broad as they are, that's how thin they are. And we can't take them for granted. Because we see the poisoning of the elites in society here in the United States as well. The Durban process is moving quickly. To me, the test of a society is not whether they have haters or anti-Semites. The test is, how does a society respond to haters? How do the authority figures deal with haters and anti-Semites? If there is a spirit of tolerance that allows people to espouse this kind of hatred to go unchecked, then the entire society pays a price ultimately. The Jews first pays the price. And frankly, I think it's wonderful that we have all the Holocaust commemorations that we do. But frankly, I'm sick and tired of people who can mourn dead Jews but have a problem with living Jews. I'm tired of those who talk about us as being the canary in the mine of hatred, of being the barometer for mankind. I'm tired of those who shed crocodile tears. Winston Churchill told Chamberlain that appeasement is feeding the crocodile in the hope that he'll eat you last. For too long, the world was ready to feed us to the crocodiles and to sacrifice Jewish blood. It became very cheap. But thank God we created a Jewish state that stood us proud again in the world and said that Jewish blood will never be cheap again. That's what differentiates this from the 1930s, that we have a state of Israel with an IDF and with an Air Force that can rescue Jews and stand up for Jews proudly. And because we live in a country that gives us the right to have a say, that we live in the one superpower in the world that is willing to stand up for us. We, thank God, have a president of the United States who gets it, who understands the dangers posed by Iran and by the war and terror, Thank God we have a Congress that stands with us, more than 90% Republican Democrats. But we can't take it for granted. The war on terror is going to define the 21st century for us, as Americans, as citizens of the world, but most of all as Jews. We are the prime targets. And when people say this is World War IV, don't dismiss it. World War I fought for Wilson's principles, World War II against Nazism, World War III against communism. Today we fight a global war. The whole earth is involved in it. Whether it's the bombings in Bali or London or Spain or France or anywhere else. For 50 years, Israel has fought this war alone. It was the front line of the war on terror, and now the American people have come to understand the pain that Israel suffered, have come to understand what Israel meant to the United States, not just what the United States means to Israel. That's why 70% of the American people stand with us. And thank God we have tens of millions of Christians who are ready to stand with Israel, sometimes more than our own community. And we should not alienate them. We should welcome them. The Christians United for Israel is doing incredible things across the United States. This is a great asset that we have to cherish. It's especially important that we recognize we live in the age of globalization, where the big lie against Jews still works. We saw it during the summer in the war in Lebanon. All the false accusations, the charges of war crimes against Israel. Is there any army in the world that fought a more humane war than Israel did, to give 12 or 24-hour notice before they bombed the place to let civilians get out? When Israel was accused of bombing the 2 ambulances, and the whole world rose up and screamed and yelled how you could attack ambulances with a rocket dropped by an airplane. Until the Prime Minister of Australia pointed out that it made a perfectly round hole. He said, how does a rocket dropped by a plane make a perfectly round hole? Until they went and checked that these were 2 rotted out ambulances that hadn't been used for many years, and somebody removed the ventilator from the top, which leaves a perfectly round hole. But the world was ready to accept the lies. They accused Israel of war crimes. Who was guilty of war crimes? Who put missiles inside mosques and schools and civilian populations and shot them to destroy civilians? And 3,000 sorties by the Israeli Air Force, less than 1,000 people were killed. And the vast majority of them terrorists. But you know, the Lebanese, once a terrorist is wounded or killed, he's no longer considered a terrorist. He's then labeled a civilian because he no longer can do terror acts. And by the way, the Red Cross buys those definitions there. So don't believe the numbers you see. You saw that Reuters had to remove 950 pictures from their archives because they were doctored, showing Israeli planes bombing civilians that never took place. 950 pictures. Did you see the apologies in the Los Angeles Times for running those pictures? Did you see apology anywhere for it? The New York Times had a front page picture showing supposedly dead Lebanese with sheets over them. But they didn't notice that one of them didn't have a chance to lie down yet, so he was still sitting up. The first Rashi in Chumash, in Bereshit, you all know, quotes Rav Yitzchak, Rashi's father. And it says, why does the Chumash, why does the Bible begin with the Torah begin with the story of Briat Olam, the creation of the world, and not the first mitzvah, Rosh Chodesh? And the answer he gives is, he says, because it says, Listimatem, when the world will accuse you in the future of being robbers, that you stole this land, you will tell them God created the earth. And he promised this land to the Jewish people for all time. It's not a contract that's bound by time or by limits. It was for all times and for all history. And Hirsch says he's not worried that the Goyim will ask the question and will have doubts. It's when Jews have doubts. When Jews are not ready to stand up and proclaim Israel's rightness and to answer these, whether it's the President of the United States or professors from Harvard or from Yale or from University of Chicago, or whether a former presidential candidate, Wes Clark, says the reason we went to war in Iraq is because of New York money people. We know what these code words mean, and we know what they can lead to. So we see a rise in our own country at a time when we live in this very powerful and wonderful country, but we see dangerous trends that we cannot dismiss. It is not state-sponsored anti-Semitism as existed in the 30s. But we know that the dangers that they pose, when Jews are compared to Nazis, it's meant to exonerate what the Nazis did. when Israelis are compared to Nazis, when we see the rise in hate groups, Ku Klux Klan and skinheads and others in Europe and in the United States, we cannot dismiss it. What we are seeing are clear trends. It's time to end the appeasement. It only leads to more and more aggression. Terrorists, Ahmadinejad, the anti-Semites are all cowards by nature. That's why they attack civilians, women, children. They don't attack military targets. They never send their children to die, they send other people's children to die. And they constantly test us. They test to probe the West for weakness, and unfortunately they find it and then they exploit it. The only answer to them is strength. Why is it that they're trying to intimidate us? Why is it they're trying to silence us? Because they see the Jews stand up and speak up for Israel and speak up for our causes. And we demonstrate that strength. The American people are ready to be with us. When we marched for Soviet Jews, everybody said, "You were crazy." I came to New York to head the Soviet Jew movement. They said they'll never be free. But when Jews stood up, the rest of the world was ready to stand up. And when we, all of you, and I see my friend Sam here as well, stood up for the Iran 13, we mobilized 66 countries, including Muslim and Arab countries. And you know that since then, they have executed every year 300 to 400 people, Baha'is, Muslims, and Christians, but not one Jew. Because what they found out is that you can kill Baha'is and Muslims and Christians and the world is silent. But you touch the Jews and the whole world comes down on you. The foreign minister of Iran saw me at a reception. He started yelling at me across a room. And he said to me, "Don't think just because every place I went they raised this issue. Don't think that the threat of economic sanctions, don't." And I started writing it all down because I knew what worked and what didn't work. You can take on the most extreme powers in the world when we stand united as one people. Whatever differences exist within our communities and within our people are irrelevant compared to what overwhelmingly unites us and challenges us, especially today. Especially today, because these decisions will affect not years or months, but generations. The decisions will affect the quality of life that our great-great-grandchildren will enjoy. The outcome of the war and terror will determine the security that they enjoy, the quality of life that they will be able to have. And we have to be willing to stand up to these voices of hatred. Whatever the guise, the United Nations Human Rights Council is going to meet this week in Geneva. They're going to again condemn Israel for what? The Mughrabi Gate, an act of racism. You know the Mughrabi Gate doesn't even touch Har HaBayit. And by definition, even in 1967, Israel was charged with the right to build at the Mughrabi Gate, because in case they closed off all the other gates, there should always be one that is open to Jews, the Har HaBayit. And look how quick the United Nations Human Rights Council, since its reformulation, it hasn't condemned or sanctioned one country, not China, not Darfur, no one, except 8 against Israel. Some things don't change. And we know that the Human Rights Commission will no doubt this week find an excuse to argue that Israel has no right to do this and Israel has no right to do that. Israel invited the Turks and now the UNESCO is going there, because Israel in this case is perfectly in the right. There is no wrong here. And I hope that they will continue to do it and complete it, because this is the year we mark the 40th anniversary of the unification of Jerusalem. It's the year in which all of us, every one of us, has to make sure that we remind the world of the Jewish claim to Yerushalayim. You know, when they opened the tunnels, Arafat said the challenge was the Judaizing of Jerusalem. 3,000 years after King David made it our capital, when Muslims and others turned their backs on Yerushalayim and faced Mecca and Medina, when others went to Rome and to other capitals, the Jews only had a love affair with one city. And that was Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is the heart of Zion, and Zion is the heart of Yerushalayim. And if the majority of the people in America identify Jerusalem with Muslims and not with Jews, it's our failure. If every time you see a Muslim leader, he's standing in front of a picture of the mosque on Har HaBayit, and every time you see a picture of an Israeli leader, he's standing in front of a picture of the mosque on Har HaBayit. I urge you all this year for the Jerusalem 40 to go to Yerushalayim, to hold events here, to remind our young people about the true history of Yerushalayim, the city that unites us all. It's the core of our existence, of our history. That's why they want to take it away. Do they care about Yerushalayim? All the years that Jordan occupied the old city, did anybody give a damn? I was there in 1966 during the Jordanian control. You couldn't walk on the streets because of the filth, because of the decay, because of the decrepit situation of things. And every day God is sending us signals. Every day, new discoveries at Ir David, at the Minarot, the tunnels. Every day, incredible discoveries. Proving the count in the Tanakh. You take a Tanakh, you see it come to life in your hands. They found the Bula, the signet ring of Yochai ben Shlomiyahu, who was the minister sent by Tzidkiyahu to put Yirmiyahu in jail. 100 meters from the bar, from the dungeon where he was kept, they found the original signet ring with his name on it. When all the stuff that was taken off Har HaBayit, after the destruction by Arafat, when he dug the entrances to Solomon's stables, and we have no clue how much other things they took, but tons of material were taken off and dumped in the old city and now taken to the Jerusalem forest. And they found recently a coin from the first Beit HaMikdash, the first time ever, and on it was the name Eliyahu. How many more signs do we need that God reminds us of our connection to Jerusalem and of our failure to assert our claim to it? All generations will hold us to account if we fail. So this year, it is especially important. It's especially important that we remind our elected officials, that remind those who represent us locally and nationally. You have to remember the responsibility we have to educate elected officials. Don't assume they know. They don't. But they want to hear from you. And when they don't hear from you, they assume either you don't care or you agree with the things being done against us. Invite them here, work with them, educate them, but first educate yourselves. Second, educate your children. Don't take the next generation for granted. We have for too long. Our kids don't know how to answer, and then when they get to campus, they're not inoculated against it, and they fall to the pressures of the social pressures and to the professors and to the others who tell them the lies and the distortions, and they don't know how to answer. And so they are intimidated, and even worse, they turn against us. You will be shocked if you talk to your children or your grandchildren about how little they know. We published a weekly called Israel Highway for high school students, and a one for college students called Israel Campus Beat, and every day we put out the daily alert. They found this was in the high schools, they couldn't use it. You know why? Because the teachers couldn't teach it in the Jewish schools. So we have an imperative now, first to educate our community and then to educate others, to build coalitions with Hispanics, with Christians, with blacks, with everybody. They're waiting to hear from us, and our silence is deafening. We have to get out of the 18th century when it comes to media. People complain about the missionaries and others with their satellite systems, that the Arabs today spread the big lie, not in months or years as it took Hitler, but in seconds with Al Jazeera and Al-Khura and Al-Manar and Al-Quds. And we don't have a single studio under Jewish auspices in America. We have to look at the textbooks that are being used, funded by your tax dollars. Do you know that in California there's a 2-week course in the high schools where kids have to live as Muslims? And when the parents challenge it in court here in your state, the court ruled against them, and then they appealed, the court ruled against them again last month. And so kids in the public school systems in California have to live for 2 weeks, dressing as Muslims, saying the Sharia, all of these things, under the name of multiculturalism, gone awry. We have to hold our media to account, and the same thing applies to them. Don't assume they know. Every letter you write counts. Every time you speak to a congressman, every letter to the editor, every call to a talk show, all of these things count. You make a difference about the Jewish future. But don't yell anti-Semitism. Argue on the basis of facts, because our strongest weapon is the truth. And we have to make Iran not a Jewish issue, but an American issue and a world issue. This is not a challenge just to us. And it is a mistake to make it into strictly a Jewish issue. Israel must speak out. And the military option should be the last option. It should never be off the table. But there are a lot of other things we can do. The economic sanctions are working. And we have to make sure that our elected officials are educated to show them how effective they are. $200 billion flowed into the Gulf last year from Iran. An Arab foreign minister told me recently that he was in Tehran a year ago, and it was a wealthy, bustling city. And when he was there in October, he said you could feel the wealth had been sucked out. Despite all the billions and billions of dollars that he's making from oil, that he's pouring into his military campaigns and his nuclear program, the fact is he's not providing jobs, 30% unemployment. You know the facts as well as I do and better. You hear from the people there. Economic sanctions work, and we can bring about a change, real change, lasting change. It's not going to be a Zionist government, perhaps, but it'll be a lot better than what is. And once that dynamic of change takes place, if we would only speak out for the human rights of the young people who stand up and demonstrated and did courageous things and the West abandoned them, to speak about these executions, where is the church? Where are all of those who condemn Israel anytime they think they blinked the wrong way, but don't say anything about these mass executions? 600,000 people put in jail in 7 months in Iran. Where's the outcry? Where's the defense of Christian communities in Muslim countries that are being decimated? Last month, 2 months ago, we held a ceremony in New York where we brought together the top legal experts, including John Bolton and Charles Rangel, the congressman who chairs the Ways and Means Committee, and leading experts to indict Ahmadinejad for violating the Genocide Convention. And we have to pursue it until he's really brought to justice for it, because the Genocide Convention says it's not just doing genocide, it's incitement to genocide. The fact that a head of state in the 21st century can threaten a member state of the United Nations and be invited to address that body is unacceptable and can never be repeated. He has to be put on the watch list now and be prevented from coming to America ever again. We have options. People say, you know, when I speak it's depressing. It's not depressing. Ignorance is depressing. When Moshe Rabbeinu gave us the mitzvah of Hakel, his message was that the greatest danger to the Jewish people is not external enemies and it's not natural disasters. It's affluence. It's when Jews become indifferent. We become so comfortable where we are and we say, look, it's for us, we have a good life. And we lose sight of the realities. We become blind to them. Our enemies count on it. They count on the fact, as Ahmadinejad himself said, that Americans have no patience. Look at the Zarqawi tapes and Osama bin Laden. Look at the determination. General Giordano said wars in the 21st century won't be determined by how much territory you capture or the number of enemies killed. It'll be determined by those who have the will and determination. Khadija said Israel can have all the weapons, all the planes, all the tanks. We have the will. Where is our will? Where are we demonstrating and showing the world where we stand and enlisting all of our friends in the non-Jewish communities to stand with us? Because that will determine the outcome. Zarqawi in every tape says, my eyes are on Jerusalem. How many of your eyes are on Jerusalem? The fact is that the difference from 30 years ago is the existence of the Jewish state. And that was a generation of tsarists. That Abba Eban once said that in World War II, Jews had influence in many places, but power in none. The difference today is that Jews have power. You have power. We could change the world if we use that power constructively and right. We have to be more humble in the way we do things. Sometimes we have to have greater humility and nobility. We don't go after every target. We have to select them. But once we do, we have to be aggressive and assured that we are victorious and effective in what we do, as we were in turning the Iron Curtain into a Venetian blind. Soviet Jews made perestroika possible, and you have the former chairman sitting here of the National Conference, Bobby Met. Things that everybody said was impossible. It changed the world. We can change the world again. But it depends on us. God has given us miracles that our grandparents and their grandparents would have given everything to see one of. One. Do you get up in the morning and say, is Israel still there? You take it for granted? Israel didn't face one Saddam Hussein, it faced 20 Saddam Husseins. And every day it faces overwhelming enemies. Not just Iran. And not only did it survive, but it thrived. Look at the economic miracles of Israel. There are more people learning in Israel today than any place, time in Jewish history. Don't take it for granted. In our lifetime, we have seen the prophetic vision of Kibbutz Galiot. Do you think about it? The Gemara says that Kibbutz Galiot is as great as the day of Bria to Olam, of the creation of the world. Do you realize that in your lifetimes, even the young people, we've seen a world created? We saw the Jews of Russia saved, the Jews of Ethiopia who were cut off for 2,000 years, the Jews of Syria who lived 50 years at the edge of hell, the Jews of Iran, the Jews of Iraq, the Jews of Yemen, the Jews of Syria, all have come home. That is the prophetic vision. Do we appreciate it? Do we thank God for the miracles that He's enabled us to see and prove ourselves worthy of it by what we do? You know the difference between Har Sinai and Har Habayit? That right after we got the Torah at Har Sinai, they could go and touch it. The people went there. Here, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence was there. And as soon as it was over and we said Na'aseh v'nishma, the Jews could go and touch it. But Har Habayit, until today, there are places we're not allowed to go to. What made Har Habayit so much holier than the place where we got the Torah? The answer of Soloveitchik said is that man, by our deeds, infuses a place with holiness. On that mountain, Abraham brought Yitzchak v'Akeda, willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. God didn't want Abraham to kill Isaac, because we don't worship death. He wanted to teach him not what to die for, but what to live for. That the progenitors of the Jewish people had to know what was really important. We built 2 Batei Mikdash on that mountain. Because of the sweat and the tears and the sacrifice of the Jewish people, that place was infused with a sanctity even greater than Har Sinai. So what we do today will infuse this time with holiness. God sanctifies time, we sanctify space, and this space, this period in history is waiting for us to respond. The anti-Semites are being heard. They're raising their voices in America, only waiting to hear us to respond. And if we are weak, they will probe that weakness and exploit it. We see the attacks against the quote Jewish lobby because they want to silence us, they want to intimidate us. But they will not succeed. Because I believe that this is a generation that has learned the lessons of the past and understands its responsibilities to the generations of the future. You know, this If Only Israel crowd, that we hear this call, if only Israel would make more concessions, if only Israel would withdraw, if only Israel would not defend its citizens, if only Israel didn't exist, everything would be okay. Who would have thought a few years ago that a major national organization, the Foreign Policy Association, would hold a conference entitled A World Without Israel? Ahmadinejad talks about a world without America and without Israel. But now that it becomes acceptable even to put this question forward, undermines the very underpinnings of our existence. This is a time when we have to stand up and speak out. You can make a difference, each of you. Each of you has to make a decision, what you give to, what you do, how many letters you write, how many stations you call, how many congressmen you reach out to, how many senators you speak to. And believe me, every letter, every email counts. Every media station is waiting to hear from you. And if they don't, you know the outcome. We have to hold to account the anti-Semites. We have to put an end to the big lies. We have to make sure that what happened in Britain doesn't happen to us. There is nothing we can't accomplish when we stand together. I told the story that last year on Shabbat Zachor, I was in Baku with the Conference of Presidents. And the last aliyah, which we gave all the aliyot to the people from the community who came to join us for the tefillot in our hotel. The last aliyah, which is Parshat Amalek, we gave to a young man who was there. And the rabbi in the community said, I want to come up with him to help him with the brachot, which he did. And after we finished the Kriyat Torah, the rabbi stopped us and he said, you don't know what you just did. And I looked at his face and he was like, it was a really disturbing expression. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know, what did we do? Did we embarrass him, something? He said, oh no. The person you called up for Parshat Amalek was the great-grandson of Stalin. There is no miracle too great. There is nothing we can't turn around when we stand together as Am Echad B'Lev Echad.